things that most of my students encounter when they're first getting their skills together in terms of playing lots of different kinds of patterns is they encounter that there's a reason that we should use alternate fingerings for F sharp and for B flat or A sharp, depending on the context, and there's the reason why I said it that way. Let's talk about F sharp first. The common fingering for F sharp is all three of these fingers plus the second finger on the right hand, so left hand, right hand, and that's the normal fingering that we use in most cases. So that's why I was using the second finger there, because I was particularly playing a D major exercise right there, which doesn't need to use any alternate fingerings. Let me stand back so you can see my head. However, whenever you're playing chromatically, and the chromatic scale is all half-step intervals, when you're playing chromatically, if you look at my horn again, you'll see that I'm using a different fingering for the F sharp. I'm using the first finger plus this key over here. Some people use their third finger. I feel a little bit more comfortable using my pinky, and that's on all the horns, on the bari sax or on the tenor sax, which you can't see very well. But all the instruments, I kind of use the same fingers. But I know other players that use different fingers depending on which sax they're playing at the moment. So if you look really carefully, I'm going to play the F sharp, but I'm going to use this key because I'm going to play an F first. So it makes a lot of sense if we're already pushing this key down and we have to switch to an F sharp from this F. It makes no sense to do this. That's really awkward. It makes a lot more sense to do this. So that's how we play the F sharp in the context of anything that's chromatic, where we're going half steps from an F to an F sharp, etc. So here I'll play the chromatic scale really slowly, just a little bit. I'll play one octave starting on D, and you can see my use of that fingering. Or, as you can see, either finger works really well. And continuing, I would go. Where did I do that? So that's the fingering that works really well for F sharp whenever we have to have an F included in a scale. Sometimes the F will be written as an E sharp. So we have to remember E sharp is really F. So usually the E sharp is either preceded or followed by an F sharp. So that's another circumstance where we would use that fingering. It's not just when we're playing chromatic scales. If we were playing, for instance, the G flat scale. Let me demonstrate that. So this is, in fact, this is the place that most of my students get a little confused when we play the G flat scale, because I usually have them start with the regular fingering for F sharp or G flat. This scale can be written as either the G flat scale or the F sharp scale. So most of my students, I have them start on the low F sharp with the regular fingering, but when we get to the end of the scale, that's where we use the alternate fingering. I'll demonstrate that. So this is the F sharp slash G flat scale. So I started here, I ended here. That's a much more efficient way to play it. If I was to play below that G flat at the bottom, then I'd still use this fingering. So you can see I continued using this one as I went down. So that's the F sharp alternate fingering. The more complicated fingering is the B flat or A sharp fingering. Now you can see me again. The B flat or A sharp fingering, there's actually 4 different fingerings we can use depending on the circumstances. The common fingering that I teach all my students first is the A fingering, 1 and 2, plus the lowest side key. You can see where that's located. So that's the most common fingering, and the reason is because you're going to encounter the B flat in the context most often of being preceded or followed by an A. So that makes a lot of sense. So I'm using the side key for all those B flats. But there's a lot of other circumstances where it's kind of annoying to have to use that side key, and I'll show you the most common one is when you're going from a G to a B flat. You can see that's not very fun. But this is where we get to use the fingering that I'm about to show you next. It's called the Bis fingering. I don't know why it's called that. Some French guy who came up with the idea called it a Bis fingering. So the Bis fingering is really interesting. If you're first starting out on a saxophone, you're probably wondering, why is there a key here, but then we skip down to here? We don't play this little one in between. Or why don't I start here and do this? Well, the reason is this is the Bis key, and it's only used in certain settings. And the setting that I'm about to show you is the most common. We actually finger the Bis key by moving our finger slightly, so we're pushing down both of these keys. Not just the first key, the B key with our first finger, but also the Bis key. And that gives us a B flat. Now we don't have to worry about that side key. We don't have to have this finger down either, which means we can go from G to B flat really easily. So there is the solution. Makes it a lot easier. So the Bis fingering is used second most often. Whenever we have flats in a song, like let's say we're playing in the key of E flat. When we have flats, that makes more sense to use the Bis key than that awkward side fingering. If we don't have a lot of flats, then this fingering is not so awkward, so it's more useful fingering. And the beauty of the Bis key, if you look carefully, while I'm playing all of the other notes in that E flat major scale, I'm going to keep my finger here. I'm not going to be moving it back and forth from just the first finger to the Bis key. I'm going to keep it on the Bis key. Can't use it chromatically, obviously. The Bis key is beautiful. I use it a lot. Okay, so let me show you the next fingering. This is called fork fingering number 1. I like to call it, there's different people use different nomenclature, but the first finger and the first finger is what I call fork fingering number 1. A lot of people just call that the fork fingering. So that's another fingering for B flat. So I just played all three. Here's the side key, here's the Bis key, and here's fork fingering number 1. Now where that's most useful is when you are arpeggiating. In other words, playing the 1, 3, 5, maybe 7, 9, 11, whatever you're skipping notes in a major scale. So for instance, if I was playing an F, well, let's see, that wouldn't work as well. If I was playing that E, going back to the E flat major scale, if I take the first note, the third note, and the fifth note, that would create what's called an arpeggio. On keyboard instruments or guitars or anything that can play chords, you can play all three of those notes at the same time and get a chord. On an instrument like this that can only play one note at a time, we have to arpeggiate them, play them in sequence. So I was illustrating the chord by arpeggiating those three notes. Okay, fork fingering number 1. This is what I call the fork fingering number 1. As I said a moment ago, as I was starting to say, it's very useful when arpeggiating a chord. A chord is what you get when you play 3 notes on a piano at the same time, or on a guitar or any other instrument that can play chords. Sax can only play one note at a time, so we arpeggiate those notes instead. So here is an opportunity to use the forked fingering number 1. This would be a B flat major chord that I'm going to arpeggiate. I'm going to play one note at a time. The 1, the 3, and the 5 of the B flat major scale. So the B flat, the D, and the F. And the forked fingering number 1 works really well because both of these fingers are used for all of those notes. So here's B flat, here's D, and here's F. So you can see I didn't move either of these fingers at all. I just kept them down the whole time. B flat, D, F. Likewise, I can go back up and down. So that's a very useful fingering whenever we have an arpeggio that has to be played that uses those 3 notes. Not as useful as the Bis key, obviously, but very, very useful in a lot of contexts. Now, sometimes you'll see a B flat written as an A sharp, and that's the most, that's where I use the forked fingering number 2 the most often. So I call it forked fingering number 2. Other people have different names for it. It's still the first finger on the left hand, and it's going to be the second finger on the right hand. So you can see it's almost the same. I'll just compare the 2. Here's forked fingering 1 and then 2. There's a very slight tonal variation, which can actually be kind of useful if you're playing in the middle of a solo and you want to get something. You can just you know, make use of all 3 of these fingers. You can actually get a really interesting sound. But the purpose that we're using it for right now is when we have to use an A sharp in an arpeggio. And here's a situation where that would happen. If, let's say, we're playing the F sharp major scale and we want to arpeggiate the chord. So the notes are F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. So we're going to use forked fingering number 2 for the F sharp and for the A sharp, which means that we only have to move these 2 fingers in between the F sharp and the A sharp. We have to take both fingers off again to get the C sharp, the 5th note of that scale. But it's still a lot more convenient to do this instead of switching to that side key. Throws off the balance and everything. So instead we use, and I can, as you can see on the C sharp, it doesn't matter if I keep this finger down. It really doesn't change it. Again, a little tonal variation, but nothing that's noticeable unless you're trying to use it in a creative way, and I often do. So that's the 4th fingering that I wanted to show you, and that's used if you're playing an F sharp arpeggio or a G flat arpeggio. I would just use the names G flat, B flat, and D flat instead of F sharp, A sharp, and C sharp. Same notes, exactly the same notes, same fingerings, just a different name that we give them, depending on the context. So it matters if you have 6 flats in the key signature or 6 sharps. It's the same scale. It's just that we have to kind of do the math in our head and you know, think about what those notes are, because we're more used to, as sax players, when we first start out, we're more used to seeing a lot of sharps than flats, and that's just because of the way that bands are created in a school setting. The flutes have a lot of flats in their I'll just demonstrate. Here's a B flat major scale. So that's a B flat major scale, which has 2 flats. On the saxophone, the same scale as a G major scale, which has 1 sharp, an F sharp. So because of the transposition, band instruments are in different keys, and so sax players learn sharps a lot in the beginning. So making the transition to flats is a little bit more hard for sax players. It's harder to go to sharps if you're a flute player or a trombone player or any other instrument that's in concert pitch. So the forked fingering is used either with the F sharp scale or the G flat scale, it doesn't matter. Let's see if there's another place where I use it. Oh yeah, E flat minor. E flat minor. Got excited there. The E flat minor is really what's called a relative minor to the G flat major. So a lot of the same notes. So that's why we can use that same fingering. We can use that forked fingering for the B flat in that circumstance, the E flat minor. We never call it the D sharp minor. That would just be too complicated of a key signature. So just to sum up, first note I always teach my students is the side key fingering. So you can see I was using that. I could also play that very same scale, the F scale, using the Bis fingering. And in fact I do. Most of the time I'm playing the F scale, I use that fingering, unless there's going to be some A's and B flats involved often. Then I choose this one. Whenever I'm looking at a piece of music and there's a lot of flats or a lot of sharps, I often look at where I'm going to use each fingering and write it in. I'll write in F1 for fork fingering 1, or F2, or Bis. Or if I don't write anything in, it's usually the side key. So I actually look at the music and kind of plan ahead when I'm practicing in my home studio, right here. And then when I get to the rehearsal, I already know which finger I'm going to use, and so I don't stumble over that. So again, the side key, the Bis key, and then fork fingering number 1, which is useful in arpeggios. That's where we use it mostly. And fork fingering number 2. So you can see I'm using it there. So those are our fingerings. Now, when you talk about the subject of alternate fingerings, it goes way beyond that. There's so many great saxophone players who have created a lot of their own fingerings to be able to communicate, because that's what we're doing with these instruments. We're trying to communicate. The greatest guy at that was Coltrane, John Coltrane. He created lots of different fingerings so that he could express himself as freely as possible. There's a lot of other great artists who have done the same. I have many books over here off the camera that include lots of different fingerings for other notes. These are just the first ones that I always show my students, and then my advanced students, I show them some of those other fingerings by some of the other artists. So that is a nice roundup of those alternate fingerings that I use and I teach my students how to use often. Again, my name is Klich. It's spelled K-L-I-C-H. It looks like Klich, but I've lived with it for 60 years now, so I think I'm okay with it. Klich. And it's been my pleasure to talk to you guys this afternoon.